The black boxes from JeJu Air Flight 2216 have finally been processed and the contents has been released to the public. All modern airliners are required to carry two black boxes. One's a cockpit voice recorder and the other one's a flight data recorder. The cockpit voice recorder records what the pilots are saying as well as any other sounds in the cockpit, such as alarms or warnings. The flight data recorder records much more information about the airplane, such as engine states and control positions. The circumstances of this crash that killed 179 people have been so puzzling that everybody's been waiting for the contents of these black boxes to help shed some light on the incident. Today, the South Korean authorities have announced that they've processed the data from both of these recorders. Today, they announced that both of these recorders stopped recording 4 minutes before the crash. This is coincidentally at the exact same time that the plane stopped transmitting ADS-B location data. It's important to note that the data wasn't corrupted, the data just never existed. Many systems in the 737 are powered by only one of the two AC or DC power buses. They were still able to communicate with air traffic control, meaning there probably wasn't a complete electrical failure, but it does indicate that an electrical failure was a contributing factor. We're going to talk a little bit more about the design of the 737 later in this video and about that concrete berm. But first, we need to talk about another accident. Why did JeJu Air Flight 2216 turn out so badly when this other accident that looks so similar turned out so differently? This was LOT Polish Airways Flight 16 and it had 231 people on board with no fatalities. To understand what made these two flights so different, we're going to need to go into the details of the incident. Flight 16 started in New York and just after takeoff, after they retracted the landing gear, they got a warning saying that the hydraulic system had failed. After consulting with some experts, they determined that hydraulic failure would only affect their landing gear, and they had a backup electrical system that would extend the gear when they got to their destination. However, when they got to Warsaw, neither of those systems worked. After troubleshooting for an hour, they lowered the flaps and set up for a low-energy landing. After touching down early on the runway, the pilots kept the plane straight, allowing it to slow down before the end. The key factor was time. They performed all their checklists and prepared themselves for an unconventional landing. The total time between the first approach and the final touchdown was over an hour. JeJu Flight 2216, on the other hand, had less than 3 minutes between declaring a mayday and touching down. They would have had no time to perform their checklist or set up for a low-energy landing. The plane touched down nearly halfway down the runway instead of at the beginning, and some estimates have put the plane landing at over 200 knots. Many pilots have asked the question why they would choose to do a go-around after a bird strike. Many pilots would have made the decision to continue and land, but the answer, as usual, might just be in the data. In the ADS-B data, right before we lose track of them, we notice wild swings in vertical speed. This would be consistent with the pilots doing evasive maneuver to get around birds. With swings that wild, it may meet the definition of an unstable approach, and depending on the SOPs of JeJu Air, that may require them to do a go-around. But what about that berm at the end of the runway? Early reports said it was a concrete berm with only some dirt around the outside. As it turns out, that 2-meter tall berm was made almost entirely of dirt with a 30-centimeter or 1-foot slab of concrete to hold the antennas. Regardless of what that berm was made of, it clearly posed a significant hazard to aircraft, so should that berm have legally been there? To answer that, we can refer to the ICAO's Aerodrome Design Manual. This airport was not under FAA jurisdiction. The ICAO requires a runway end safety area, which is an area clear of all obstacles that are not frangible. That is to say, within the runway end safety area, there can be equipment that may break away if an aircraft hits it. Their maximum required clearance is 240 meters. That berm was placed about 260 meters away. That is to say, this installation likely conforms to that standard. But regardless of the legality of the berm, should that berm have been there? Some experts have even gone so far as to say these berms exist nowhere else in the world. But let's go check out some airports from around the world, specifically Warsaw's Chopina Airport. That's the same airport that LOT Flight 16 landed at. Off the end of runway 11 exists a very similar berm right before the ILS localizer. It is constructed completely non-frangible, unlike the blast shields right next to it. When an airplane leaves the runway at high speeds, even without a berm, there's no guarantee of survivability. TAM Airlines Flight 3054 departed a runway in 2007, killing 187 people on board and a further 12 on the ground. Air India Express Flight 812 also left the runway in 2010, killing 158 of the 166 people on board. So if leaving the airport is so deadly, and that berm is so deadly, what can we possibly do? Enter the Engineered Material Arrestor System, or EMAs for short. These systems are designed to be placed at the end of runways to slow down an aircraft, providing no human injuries and minimal aircraft damage. Currently approved systems use blocks that crush under the weight of an aircraft. While these systems are expensive to install, they have proven to be quite effective. The current standard says an EMAS system will bring a plane to a stop if it's going 70 knots or less. JeJu Air, once it left the runway, was doing 160. Many have noted that it appears the right engine of JeJu Air Flight 2216 was running, and the sound of jet engines can be heard during the final sequence. Some have even speculated that they might have even had enough power to go around and try again, but we have to understand a bit about how these high bypass engines work, like the CFM56 found in the Boeing 737. The central section of the engine compresses air, ignites it with fuel, and throws it out the back to produce power. Part of that power is harvested with a turbine, which is used to turn a fan at the front of the engine. In these engines, around 80% of the thrust is produced using those fans. But those fans are also the most vulnerable to impact, as they'd be the first place a bird would strike. It is entirely possible that that fan was crippled while the central core was still producing around 20% thrust. To make matters worse, the reverse thrust works entirely on that fan. If the pilots put the engine in reverse with the fan being inoperative, they may have inadvertently only been adding forward thrust. Alarmingly, South Korean authorities have performed police raids on JeJu Air as well as the Muon Airport Authority. This may indicate that they weren't cooperating with the investigation or that political interference may be involved.